Okay, great. Okay, so yeah, I'll get right into it. I grew up in Ontario. I have a Bachelor's of Arts in Environmental Studies and a Master's in Sustainability Studies from Trent University. I led the fossil fuel divestment campaign on my campus from 2012 to 2016. So I did a number of things during that time. I started a petition with over 1,000 signatures, started a faculty open letter, participated in a student debate, organized a faculty debate, got endorsements from student groups, presented to the Board of Governors, and organized a rally on campus. I was also the Environment and Sustainability Commissioner for our student union and the student representative on the Environmental Advisory Board. I wrote my master's thesis on the effectiveness of different tactics and strategies of opposition to the Trans Mountain Pipeline. So I was living in BC for most of that time. Doing my research was interviews with activists, politicians, and First Nations, as well as participation in the things that were going on at the time. I volunteered for different environmental groups over the years, including My Sea to Sky in Squamish, Dogwood BC, and Neighbors United. Some of the major wins that I've accomplished over the years was getting Golden to commit to 100% renewable energy by 2050, which is a campaign by Neighbors United. I also got Powell River to endorse the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is a global treaty to phase out fossil fuels. And I acquired a grant from Columbia Basin Trust to finish installing solar panels on Golden Secondary School. I'm on the board of directors of Wildsite Golden for over 2 years now, and the coordinator of the Climate Action Task Force. I also work as the air quality coordinator for Wildsite Golden and the electric vehicle car share coordinator for Golden Community Resources Society, and previously the invasive plant program coordinator also with Wildsite Golden. In the past, I have also worked as a sea kayak guide, volunteer ski patrol, and a ski instructor at Kicking Horse Mountain Resort. And in my spare time, I like to go ice climbing, rock climbing, ski touring, play guitar, and cook. And so what sort of prompted me to get into politics is because I feel like with the climate crisis, it's more and more evident that um, it is not only is it happening, but it's more serious than what even the scientists have predicted. And still, we don't have leaders in government that are still saying or doing the right things. And so 2023 was the hottest year on record and BC's worst wildfire season on record. Yet here in BC, we keep approving new fossil fuel projects and logging old growth forests. So we keep figuratively digging ourselves further into the hole. And I know that, climate isn't the only issue that people are facing in BC right now. We also have an affordability crisis, housing crisis, mental health crisis, and so forth. But I really see how the climate crisis, for example, or other environmental issues are sort of tied into those other issues as well, whether it's the economy. Wildfires cost our province almost $1 billion last year. So these things are exacerbating the cost of living crisis. Pollution from fossil fuels is responsible for about 1 in 7 premature deaths in Canada uh, every year, according to the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. And wildfire smoke and extreme weather events are also causing, an array of mental health problems and the mental health issues associated with climate grief and ecological anxiety. And of course, it's harder to exercise and do things that are good for people's mental health when we have things like wildfires and flooding that are risking people's livelihoods. So 4 of my top priorities that I would bring to the legislature. So the first one, pretty obvious, climate action and environmental protection. So there's a number of things that we could be doing in BC right now to address this. One of those things would be to ban advertisements for fossil fuel companies in the same way that tobacco products are not allowed to advertise. fossil fuel companies are arguably worse for our health than tobacco products, but they are allowed to advertise. And a lot of their advertising is actually, very misleading, whether it's the gas industry promoting their products as being clean or sustainable because it might be slightly cleaner than coal, for instance, is still, it's misleading and it's not representing the full story, which is gas is still a fossil fuel. It is still bad for our health and it is still bad for the climate. We also need to stop expanding fossil fuels and approving new fossil fuel projects if we want to meet our climate targets and stabilize the Earth's climate. As well as old growth logging. Old growth forests are one of our most important defenses against climate breakdown, and protecting them is incredibly important in the fight against the climate crisis. And they also have many other benefits, including helping to reduce erosion, flooding, and so forth. Also, increasing taxes on oil and gas companies at a federal level would help raise a lot of revenue that could be used for things like clean energy or to give money back to people that are being gouged at the pumps from companies, and phasing out fossil fuel subsidies. So both in Canada and in BC, we still subsidize the fossil fuel industry to the tune of billions of dollars. So taking those subsidies out is incredibly important. Another thing I would really like to see in BC is universal mental health care. So mental health care isn't covered in the same way that physical health care is covered in Canada and in BC. So the BC Greens are proposing a 12-month pilot project for psychologists to be covered under a government-funded billing system like MSP. And that way, mental health is, it's so much rooted in our society. And if someone wants mental health treatment, it can be very expensive and hard to access. So making it accessible in the same way that physical health care is.
You want
Also,
us to keep questions for later? Maybe that's easier. Hey, you.
yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm, yeah, I don't have much more. Um, yeah, and then addressing inequality and corporate greed. So as people in BC struggle to pay rent, groceries, and gas, real estate owners, grocery store companies, and oil companies are making record profits. And not a lot of anger is actually directed towards this. Right now in Canada, a lot of the anger is being directed for the carbon tax, for example, even though it's only responsible for a very small percentage of inflation and increase in food prices, and we also get money back in rebates. But the Conservative Party, for example, isn't directing the anger towards these companies that are making record profits off of consumers. And the last thing is electoral reform. So in BC, just like at every other province in Canada and at a federal level, we use first past the post voting system, which is our electoral system is divided into ridings, and the winner of all those ridings is then elected to the legislature or to parliament. Proportional representation, on the other hand, translates the percentage of votes into the percentage of seats. So 40% of the votes would equal 40% of the seats, where in first past the post, a majority government is often achieved with 40% of the votes or less. And it also, first past the post, that is why strategic voting exists, because if you live in a riding where your first party of choice doesn't have a chance of winning, then you might vote for another party to try and prevent another party from being elected. So you're not actually voting for your first party of choice all the time. You're voting for the party that you think has the best chance of winning against the party you dislike the most. And that is a dysfunctional democracy. That's not how a democracy is supposed to work. You should be able to vote for the party you like the most. So yeah, those were my top priorities. And so now we can open it up if there are any questions or just anything people want to add, then we can open it up to that now.
I just had a probably a minor question. I agree with climate action being absolutely necessary and sort of being the overarching issue that's going to affect everything else and the affordability of everything else. But the question I had was related to the 12-month pilot for universal mental health care. In Golden, I worked in mental health for quite a few years, and psychologists can be hard to find. So I was wondering whether a pilot like that would also consider registered counselors as because they may be more accessible in smaller communities than psychologists are.
Hmm. Yeah,
That
there.
was, yeah, kind of a nitty-gritty question, but
Uh-huh. Yeah, I guess there would be a need for to tr like for training new psychologists. And I know even and you might even know more about this than me too, in that like some people that are practicing psychologists, um, it's not necessary for them to have a degree to practice those things too. So sort of increasing the amount, I guess, of psychologists and counselors that we have, but also increasing
the
uh,
standards.
the standards for them to make sure that it is
Yeah.
um, so that when people are going into counseling or therapy, that they're actually receiving
I think
quality.
the issue is not with psychologists. I think you need to have a degree in psychology, but with counseling, yeah, there can be issues for sure.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that is, yeah, I think that's a probably a challenge and something that will have to be addressed as well, is bringing more psychologists in for sure.
Yeah.
But at least with the psychologists that we have now, we could start to offer somewhat of a universal system. And I know the system that the party is proposing is just for 6 sessions,
Mhm.
and you would have to be referred by your healthcare practitioner
Mhm.
as well. Yeah, and then yeah, yeah, to go and that's and you could also say, investing in those things is also helping to, reduce our costs in other areas, whether it's social housing or harm
Absolutely. Yeah.
reduction
Mhm.
and things like that. But yeah, to answer your question, I think we would have to find more psychologists, and that I think could could be a challenge.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Calvin.
Okay. Bill or Chris, if there's anything, and I'm also happy to keep talking about the party policies as well. But if you
First of
guys,
all, I want to say I'm really impressed with you as a candidate, and that obviously a very strong background in climate action, climate activism. Going back more than 10 years. That's impressive, and with that, you bring a lot of knowledge and commitment around climate action, and I think it is. We are indeed, as everybody knows, deeply in a climate crisis, and it's appropriate to make it the top issue in election in the upcoming election. So with you on all of that, you speak very well and clearly. So yeah, I think you'd be a great candidate. And I did want to, well, a couple of things. One is you probably know a third of my number three of my four children, and that is Stefan Green, who was ski patrol as well, maybe 3, 4, 5 years ago at Kicking, 3, 4, 5, 6 years ago at Kicking Horse, and also very active in ice climbing and climbing and backcountry skiing, as you seem to be, but he now lives in Canmore. Uh, in any case, did want to explore the electoral reform idea and tie that in with Chris's comment about the excessive partisanship in our system, which is a serious problem, just highlighted by that open letter from a broad cross section of Canadians about reducing the partisanship in our, reducing the very ugly, nasty, perhaps somewhat social media driven partisanship. And so I'd mean, and I think what gives me hope is that both the federal and provincial Green Party have acted with less partisanship, and I think Elizabeth May has been very, very much acting in this way, which is to not act in a highly partisan way. But I'd certainly, and so certainly appreciate hearing from Chris about what Chris thinks can be done to reduce partisanship. Hear from Chris about how, we have municipal councils across BC that don't have partisanship, or except in Vancouver, I guess, maybe Victoria as well. And hear your thoughts on how you can make a nonpartisan system work, but then tying that in with the theme of electoral reform, which I'm just wondering whether I'm a strong believer in electoral reform. I've put effort into all the electoral reform campaigns going back 20 years now, and therefore acting out of a place of disappointment, after this big efforts we put into it in BC and coming very, very, very close to achieving a mandate for electoral reform. So I'm just not sure that it's a winning issue, and I'd appreciate hearing from you how you would frame it and make it a winning issue. So those are the things I agree with. With the possible exception of electoral reform, I definitely agree with all the priorities you've identified. Certainly, mental health, inequality, and corporate greed, all really critically important points. Certainly like to hear from Chris about the partisanship issue, and from you about linking that to electoral reform. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, it's a good question, because even like within, the Green Party or other parties, it's not really an issue, electoral reform, that's really talked about that much. It's sort of it's harder for people to connect with that as an issue as opposed to things like the climate crisis or healthcare or housing or so forth. Um, but I really do feel that, part of my role is to explain to people how the electoral system works and how it really, is not fair and doesn't make sense. Because I think there is still a lot of people that, there's definitely a lot of people that don't understand that, even really understand what our electoral system is, what the alternatives are, and why it is unfair. And I think that, at least the more people that know that, then, that issue could be a bigger issue when people realize that their vote for their first party of choice isn't actually, doing anything depending on the riding they're in. Well, how are they as a voter supposed to vote for a party that wants these things and expect change if their vote isn't even doing anything, depending on where they live?
Yeah.
And I know, like for the Green Party is, of course, they are a big victim in this as
Mhm.
well. Like we would have had, 15% of the seats, where we got 2.5% of the seats in the last election. But, that being said, electoral reform is an issue that sort of transcends boundaries. At the federal level, in the last election, the Conservatives they just beat the Liberals in the popular vote, but they wouldn't have got a majority. So without a majority, they wouldn't have been able, to pass anything unless they actually got some of the other parties' support. So I do feel that,
Yeah. I
elect
think especially with because things have become so partisan, if you have proportional representation as a government, you're forced to cooperate and to come and to find some middle ground. And sometimes when compromises are when people look for compromises, you could argue that in the end, some decisions will be made that are sort of not really doing a good job one way or the other. But I would think in the majority of situations, having parties compromise, especially when standpoints right now are so polarized and so far apart, is, compromise is a good thing and is good for the province.
Yeah.
We had
Like,
it federally, it'd be good for the country, but right now we're, talking provincial politics. So
mhm.
I absolutely am in favor of proportional representation. Where I grew up in Holland, that's what they have. It doesn't necessarily reduce polarization, but you do end up with programs and policies that are more balanced, I think, overall, because people have to compromise.
Yeah, for sure. And as you know, like without first past the post, we would pretty much never have a majority government, like you said. So if anything wanted to be passed, there would have to be some bipartisan sort of cooperation. And I think just the fact that if I'm making it a top issue for me, I'm at least helping get the word out too and educating people where, like you said, Bill, I think that a big reason that the referendum didn't pass years ago was largely because of, just lack of understanding. People didn't really understand what the alternative was, so they just went with something that they knew. So
Yeah.
I think it, yeah, like it's not something that the Green Party, makes the center of their platform. But I think, the only way to build momentum on it and to finally get proportional representation is to start talking about it and build support for it. And, that's how I think we'll get it one day, even though, maybe not right now. You could say it's the winning issue, but I think that it's important in that sense in the long run.
Yeah, I
Well,
really agree with you, Calvin.
Yeah.
I agree with your approach in terms of an education and outreach kind of approach on the proportional. People do need to understand how our current system works. They do need to understand the shortcomings, I guess. And again, I've always been a strong supporter of proportional representation, but right now I can't help but think of Israel with a proportional representation and an absolute madman as prime minister. Probably through obviously through extensive manipulation of the system. So then we have to ask the question, which system is more prone to manipulation like that?
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't think, proportional representation in terms of, what your political leanings are, there's some situations where you wouldn't want it. But I think at the end of the day, it is more fair overall, even though, you could say the federal election, the People's Party, they would have had some seats with proportional representation. But it's really looking at, um, and again, in terms of what your political leanings are, weighing the benefits and the negatives. And I really do think that the benefits still far outweigh the negatives. Chris, are you still with us?
Yeah, I am still here. I've turned my video off because I'm having bandwidth issues here
Okay.
and he's kind of bobbing in and out on me. That's the only reason I turned off my videos.
Well,
Yeah,
we can hear you well, Chris.
you can or can't?
We can. I can. Yep.
Okay, good. Yeah, I mean, that's where my years on municipal politics, well, it'll be 30 years by the time I'm done this term. So it's and it's nonpartisan, always has been. I've never been a part of any political party, but maybe my approach of being sitting on the outside trying to make a difference rather than getting involved in making a difference isn't the way to do it either, because we're still where we were many years ago. I mean, I was very disappointed when it seemed that there was a fairly good, there was an effort put in by the NDP when they were elected to bring in electoral reform. And then there was such a huge wave put on by the opposition to, once the traction got turned around, you'll never get it back. So it has to be a long, slow process of trying to educate people and make people see what electoral reform could look like and could do. So I won't make it an election issue, but I'm glad to hear that you would support it if it comes forward.
Mhm. Yeah.
Chris, are you ready for me or you want me to come back?
Um,
So what do you see, Calvin, as some of the big issues that the Green Party will focus on in the next election? Apart from electoral reform, which you've said yourself is important, but not the main issue right now.
Yeah. So yeah, there's of course housing is a big one. So in terms of that, the Green Party definitely supports building more not-for-profit housing, and then that can sort of compete with the market, which would again drive down prices. And they've introduced some things, fairly recently, the Residential Tenancy Amendment Act. They just put forward a little while ago, which would basically prevent landlords from increasing rents as much as they want in between evictions.
Mhm.
Um, and then, yeah,
That's
making,
huge. Yeah.
yeah. Mhm. And then even like in terms of housing, making sure that, housing is properly, ready for extreme weather events and climate change, whether it's, flooding and wildfires and so forth. And then for, back to healthcare, things like, again, one of the other things that, you know, I was thinking about putting on my top priorities too is, the toxic drug crisis. And that's something that's been really politicized as well. Um, and just the fact that, we've had, around 6 people die every day in the province. And, the BC Greens are very much from the side of, having safe supply and harm reduction to help people who have drug addiction issues or mental health issues, where, on the other side is saying that, we shouldn't have decriminalization, we shouldn't have safe supply and things like that. But, we've seen that criminalization, on the other hand, doesn't work.
Yeah.
So
One of
that,
my big concerns is that with the other parties, and in BC, I would not count the NDP under that, but is the attack on expertise and on working with people who have a real understanding. And when you're talking about the opioid crisis, I think people that work in that field, they know what works, and they're having a hard time, fighting off all the misinformation that is out there. And so somehow, and I guess the same would be true for any issue a government is dealing with, that you have to listen to people that really understand the complexity, whether it's climate change or housing regulations or anything like that. So, and I don't know how a party can, other than setting the right example, which I think the BC Greens absolutely are doing. I don't know what other options there are.
yeah, in terms of like It's the same thing as like, the carbon price, for example. We have like politicians saying that, things that are pretty much not true, and it's not really what, economists are saying either. And
Mhm.
it's sort of the same thing with the toxic drug crisis. People that work in social work and so forth are saying that, we need to be doing this, where politicians are sort of saying the opposite. And one thing that the government can do is like establish sort of like a bipartisan committee, which is, the government can meet with experts and people from those fields, and then they can actually come to conclusions and decisions, that isn't totally, partisan and
Mhm.
political.
Yeah. Like creating platforms where people that are those that are in power are exposed to the knowledge and the complexity that people have that work in whatever field it is, right? Every field has its own complex knowledge.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that sounds.
Calvin, do you feel you're getting the support from the provincial party that you need to run an effective campaign? I mean, I'm getting the impression that the provincial party is, I mean, it was always a disappointment in federal elections, particularly the last one I ran in, that the party didn't really seem to provide good, strong support to candidates across the country. And so I'm just wondering if you feel you're getting the level of support you need from the provincial party, or if there's additional help,
Mhm.
additional things that would really benefit you.
Yeah, I'd say support is like it's pretty good. It's sort of just the amount that you want. And, as if you kind of ask for help, then they will kind of, they will help you. But, in terms of like other campaigns, I don't have, like a campaign manager or like things like that, people that are sort of more involved in that way. Uh,
Mhm.
so that's been, I guess, a bit more challenging so far. Uh,
Mhm.
yeah, just sort of having someone that's more like, okay, this is what you need to do next. This is what we're doing, as opposed